This video is brought to you by Hangar 360 Aircraft Services.
Good morning, everyone. This is Mark Allen with the CAF. Behind me is the P-63F. It was built by Bell in 1945 in Buffalo, New York. It's a very unique airplane. It was the only F model built by Bell. It was produced for the specifications for the Russians, and the Russians were going to order about 1,000 of them, but the war ended before it got past its testing phase. So the airplane itself was never transferred to the Air Force and was held by Bell until 1946, when it was eventually sold to the public. The airplane is very unique in itself in that it has a 1,500 horsepower Allison V12, and it has a very unique tail. It has a very pointed tail to help counteract the extra power from that engine. So it's unique in that point. The Bell itself, the P-63 itself, was built primarily around a gun, a 37mm cannon in the nose that fires through the center of the propeller. And also in the nose it has two 50 caliber guns. In order to have all that ordnance or those guns in the nose of the airplane, they had to put the engine behind the pilot. So if you look closely, you'll see that the engine is behind the pilot, and then the big gun. So let's go into some detail about that. As you can see, the nose has the 37mm cannon in it. The top has the two 50 cals in the top. And behind here, from the engine behind the pilot, runs a prop shaft, a shaft that runs directly down the center line of the airplane to a gearbox which sits here. The gearbox then drives the propeller, and through the gearbox runs the 37mm cannon. So behind all these panels are the 37mm gun and the two 50 cals. The interesting thing is the 37mm had about 40 rounds in it, and they were held in the magazine and stayed in the magazine. But the 50 cals had to eject its shells. But clearly, to eject the shells, they'd end up going through the radiators of the airplane. So the cartridges were kept internally and then ejected when they got on the ground. So little and unique factors. As you can see, if you look in the radiators down through here, the radiators keep the airplane cool and keep the oil cool. The other unique thing about the P-63, as you can see, it has a nose gear. It's not the traditional tail wheel airplane that most fighters were in World War II. So this big, long nose gear to handle the very large 13-foot diameter propeller. The cockpit itself, as you can see, has traditional car doors with roll-up windows. The airplane's widest point actually is the exhausts coming out of the engine, so it's a very narrow airplane, and it is quite tight in the cockpit, and we'll look at the cockpit a little later. The other unique thing about this airplane, to a certain degree, copied the P-51. It has a laminar flow wing. The airplane that preceded this was the P-39, as you know, was not a laminar flow wing. The airplanes look similar, but they're quite a bit different. The P-63 is quite a bit bigger than the P-39. Going around the airplane, it has quite a wide wing, as you can see. You'll also note it has a fairly long aileron with fairly small flaps. The reason it has large ailerons is that it is quite a heavy airplane in the roll controls. So it has that because the wings hold all the fuel, and the fuel, as you can see, is outboard of the landing gear, and the landing gear is quite wide out. So the ailerons are quite heavy because you're moving this mass of fuel that is quite far out on the wings. On the other hand though, the pitch control is very, very light. And that was due to primarily the weight of the engine is behind the pilot. So it's in the center of the airplane, the center mass of the airplane. On an airplane that has the engine in the front of it, when you traditionally have quite heavy pitch controls because you're trying to move that mass of the engine. As you can see on the tail, very high tail on it with a fairly big rudder to control the extra torque of that engine. Also, it has this big strake on the bottom also to help with control. It has traditional fabric controls in the back, rudder and elevators. In the center of the fuselage was held all the avionics, so it has a radio compartment on both sides that held avionics for the airplane. As you can see conventionally, the engine in the back. The big scoop at the top was for the carburetor. That's where it got all its air from. All these access panels, as you can see, are labeled for the various things that are used. Yeah. So I'm going to jump in here. You can see it's quite tight getting into the airplane. The first thing that strikes you about the airplane, even though it's quite tight, is that the wing is sort of behind you. Traditional tailwheel airplanes, you're right in the center of the wing, and when you look down, you don't see the ground, you see the wing. But in this airplane, when you look down, you see the ground. So it's a little different from that point of view. As you can see, conventional instrumentation, standard engine instruments, standard flight instruments. We've got all our armament controls over here. We've got a GPS in this, and there's standard radios. It's got your fuel controls down here, your trim controls over here. As you can see with this, you can see the standard traditional car door with the roll-up window. So that works pretty nice. It's nice for air conditioning. You can open those and taxi and take off before takeoff. It is a castering nose wheel, so it's worked either by traditionally by brakes. So you can get a little rudder authority in the turn, but traditionally you're tapping on the brakes to control left and right turning.
Can you fly it with the windows rolled down?
You can, but you're not going to be able to roll them up.
Really?
So then at some point it's going to get cold. So once you get them, once they're open, you're not going to be able to roll them up. You could roll them up halfway, but there's too much air pressure in the airplane to allow you to roll them up. The visibility is not as nice as say for instance a Mustang. You've got a lot of framework around here. Exactly. Thank you. You've got a thick windshield looking through. We don't have a gun sight in there for safety reasons, but you'd have a big old gun sight that would stick out here. So the visibility is not great. The Russians used the airplanes both in fighter roles and in air to ground traditional tank busters type roles. The cannon was very effective in that with and it could carry bombs and rockets as well. So it was pretty good ground attack airplane. So this airplane is like all electric airplane. The flaps, the landing gear, obviously pumps and all those kinds of things, all are electric. The only thing that's hydraulic is the brakes. So if you have an electrical problem, you can manually crank the gear down. It takes quite a while, and it's quite an effort. We've done it, in test in flight. It may be even more difficult. So on the V speeds, the V&E on the airplane, top speed on the airplane is about 425 miles an hour. It stalls very conventionally. It's got a straight wing. Stalls about flaps up about 70 miles an hour, with flaps down about 65, 64 miles an hour. Flap and gear speed is 170 miles an hour. So you can come in pretty fast and lower the gear and get yourself slowed down for landing. It lands very well. It lands like a big old Cessna. Yeah, you got to keep the nose nice and high, keep the nose off. Just land it on its mains. just let the nose come down conventionally.
With that nose gear being so long, is it kind of what is that considered maybe a weak link?
It could be, but it seems pretty pretty strong in itself. I've had some circumstances where I've really had to honk on the brakes, and it handles it pretty well. Well, thank you very much for joining me on this tour of the P-63. Hopefully you'll see it on the air show circuit shortly. Come over and visit, and we can talk some more about the airplane.